All right, terrific. Welcome everyone to panel number 3 of 2022 Interlink Online International Seminar. I thank my colleagues Natalia Villamizar from Newcastle University, Ana Marcela Ardila Pinto from Universidad Federal de Minas Gerais, and Diego Hernández from Universidad Católica del Uruguay for being part of the organizers of this seminar series. I also thank Daniel Oviedo, the coordinator of the Latin American chapter of Interlink. I'm David Lopez Garcia, postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy in the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I will be the chair for this panel. The panel is titled Public Transportations to Enhance Inclusion, Infrastructures, Modes of Transport, Travel Behavior, and Transport Policies in Urban Planning. And our presenters are going to take us to places like Santiago de Chile, Mexico City and Mexican cities overall. We're going to go to Bolivia, and then we're going to go to Colombia and back to Mexico. All right. We have 4 presentations in this panel, and we have roughly 2 hours for the panel. So each presenter can take 15 minutes. I'm going to be doing the annoying task of taking care of the time. So I apologize in advance, but I'll tell everyone when you're like, when you have 5 minutes remaining, so you can start like wrapping up your presentation and we can move on with the panel, all right? We also have Diego Hernández from Universidad Católica del Uruguay, who has kindly accepted to be the commentator of the panel. So thank you, Diego, for your participation. So, you know, this is a traditional Zoom room, right? Everyone can enable their cameras and their microphones. So, you know, Zoom etiquette, right? By this point should be very clear. Let's all keep our microphones muted to avoid background noise. Only the person speaking will turn it on. We'll go ahead with the 4 presentations, each of them taking 15 minutes. We'll then hand it over to Diego for the comments on the panel, and then we can have a round of discussion, right? Anyone can raise their hand, turn on their camera, and just turn on their microphone and jump into the discussion with the presenters. All right, so without further ado, let's get it started. And the order is the following. We're going to start with Ignacio Tiznado-Aitken. We'll move with Angélica Valera. We'll move with Juan Cabrera, and then we'll hand it over to Orlando Sabogal-Cardona. All right, so let me introduce our first presenter. And Ignacio, you will be able to share your screen. If you want to start setting up your slides, please go ahead. So Ignacio Tiznado-Aitken is a postdoctoral fellow and research coordinator of the Suburban Mobilities Cluster in the Department of Human Geography in the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He holds a PhD in transportation engineering from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He was a postgraduate researcher at the Institute for Transport Studies in the University of Leeds, and he worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Sustainable Urban Development in Chile. His research interests encompass qualitative and quantitative methods to address transport justice issues. His work focuses on sustainable transport, public transport, equity, gender, accessibility, and affordability. Ignacio, thank you for participating in the seminar. Take it away, please.
Thank you so much, David, for a great introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here in this very interesting and diverse panel. Today, I will be presenting a work developed with other colleagues in Chile about the divide between urban mobility policies or plans and academic research, particularly the socially oriented research. Of course, I thank to my colleagues, Giovanni, Rodrigo, Lucas, and Catalina for this great work. So the agenda for today's presentation is like a very typical structure. I will start with some background, particularly our motivation and contribution with this work. I will present then our work itself, the data and methods that we use, and a summary of the main findings of this study, and finally, some takeaways, challenges, and next steps for future research. So let's start with the background of our research. We know that individual characteristics and personal capabilities combined with the built environment and transport infrastructure can generate very diverse and unequal forms of accessibility. We know thus that mobility can reinforce or alleviate the existing forms of social exclusion and inequalities in different areas of our daily lives, particularly by enabling or preventing people's access to a wide range of urban opportunities. In the past decade, there has been like a growing debate around these topics, considering transportation, mobility, equity, and justice. Here I list some of the academic references from the theoretical or conceptual side that were like very influential during these years, but also has been like a lot of practical applications worldwide using those theoretical principles. However, the socially oriented research seems to have like a very limited impact on policy approaches at the urban and metropolitan scale. There are some planning experiences that have tried to address some of these inequalities through road space, infrastructure, or different policies in the Latin American region. But the truth is that this is not like a very regular practice in the region. So the problem is that, if we can define, basically the problem is that policymakers tend not to adopt a transport equity and social exclusion agenda in policy and practice. This can be attributed to several different reasons, and here I point to some of them that have been like developed in the literature. So first, the data that is needed to characterize mobility patterns and needs of different population groups. This is particularly true in small or developing countries or cities with a lack of quality data. Second, a lack of clear criteria to include equity in project evaluation or policy evaluation. Third, participation issues like hearing and co-create with those in need is key for adopting an agenda like this. And also this tendency to ignore some issues related to governance, such as like power imbalances or this legitimacy, right? So considering this scenario, we intend to observe these concerns in place in our own city. All the researchers are from Santiago in Chile, which is a very good portrait of the Latin American experience in terms of inequalities and mobility problems. So our work has a threefold objective. The first one is to identify the main concepts and dimensions in the academic work related to mobility, accessibility, and social exclusion, but particularly in Santiago, evidence from Santiago de Chile. Then to examine the different national, metropolitan, and municipal policy approaches to analyze basically their guiding concepts and how they are applying some of these concepts and dimensions of the academic work into the real policy at different planning scales. And finally, to discuss the existing gaps between this body of research in Santiago and the ongoing transport planning and urban policy. So before doing our analysis, we posed different hypotheses on the Santiago case. First, we believe that plans and policies really engage with the complex academic debate and the different dimensions that you can see from different academic work. And second, we believe that plans and policy usually lack like a coherence among the discourse, norms, and actions, and that could be observed in very different ways at different planning scales. So let's see our work then. Consistent with our goals, we started by doing like a literature review of the academic work focused in Santiago. We include more than 70 references with work on both qualitative and quantitative research. And then we organized the main findings in a conceptual framework that could help us to analyze 14 documents at different planning scales. So basically, we perform a content analysis, coding the documents based on the dimensions that we identify in the academic literature synthesis. And we try to quantify like the codes in each document, identifying the main dimensions, the main topics that were emphasized or prioritized in the different spatial planning instruments. And finally, we identified some gaps between the academic research and policy. So what about the documents we analyzed? As I mentioned before, we considered 14 different documents at different planning scales, national, metropolitan, and municipal. And you can see here in the table that the documents include both urban development and transport documents. And for the municipal documents, we select the ones where publicly available, trying to capture different socioeconomic realities. So here you can see like a map of Santiago. We select 4 different municipalities. Renca is a low-income municipality in Chile. Santiago is more like middle income. We're mixing socioeconomic terms. And Providencia and Vitacura are more wealthy districts. So we try to select these municipal or planning scale documents in a very diverse way, considering the documents that were publicly available. So our literature review allows us to identify different key dimensions in the academic work in Santiago, and I will provide a brief description of each one. First, the socio-spatial structure. Santiago appears to be like a very segregated city where you can see a spatial mismatch between residences and workplaces affecting all socioeconomic groups. There's also this dimension about mobility flows, the expansion of the city, and its polarization as well, determine like a growing number of trips. Different population groups have different possibilities to move in the city. Third, accessibility, because Santiago emerged as a city in which access to opportunities is very unequal due to decades of strategies and lack of coordinated transport and land use policy that reinforce like a structural inequality in the city. There's also costs and benefits related to transportation and how they are unevenly distributed in the city. The spatial dimension of mobility, because most of the research has focused on low-income groups living in Santiago in more pericentral, peripheral, peri-urban areas. Mobility practices as well, how individuals construct different spaces of everyday life and action, suggesting a tendency for low-income people to remain very confined given their possibilities to move. Also, the relationship between mobility and transport. Basically, the city transport system not necessarily enhance individual possibilities to move in the city, and transport can become even an element of segregation. And the last one is mobility as an interdependent practice, determined by the relational networks to which a certain person belongs. So all this work can be like classified as more quantitative or qualitative research. And it's important to highlight this after when we analyze the different documents that we consider for this work.
Ignacio?
Yeah, 5 minutes, right?
5 minutes remaining, yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
so we summarize our findings in a table like this. I don't want you to take like a very detailed look. I know that it's like too small, but basically the idea was disaggregating each of the dimensions that I mentioned before in a more refined codes, and then identify which of them were mentioned in the 14 planning documents, both in a more like discursive way or in a more concrete way in forms of a norm and action of a policy. So more red colors mean more mentions with concrete actions, and less intense like yellow colors mention less mentions and less concrete actions. So several things can be highlighted here. I want to focus on just some key findings. First, the instruments appear to be very little nourished by the debates and reflections coming from the academic literature. You can see some cases in red, like access to green areas or age as key socio-demographic terms, with a lot of mentions or concrete actions, but overall, the table you see, and there's like a lot of blank spaces and yellow ones as well. This is particularly true for qualitative approaches. For example, the dimensions of mobility and transport, or the relational dimension of mobility, is not very present in all the documents that we analyze. And finally, an important thing is that scales matters. The emphasis of each planning tool is very different. And for example, more concrete actions can be seen in local instruments. So when we analyze the instruments at national or regional levels, we can see that it's more like a more discursive, of course. They usually highlight more quantitative approaches to mobility, talking about like a spatial mismatch between housing and jobs, transport externalities, and how well distributed are transport investment in the city. They reflect also like a very traditional vision of transport policy, focusing on very general ideas about congestion, infrastructure, public transport level of service, and overall well-being of users. By contrast, municipality scale instruments tend to focus more on quantitative approaches, and they concentrate more on problems, concrete problems, and feasible solutions. They focus on quantitative approaches to support projects impacting communities, for example, new urban development areas, new subway lines, or feasible actions to improve accessibility to public transport. Despite these qualitative approaches are not very much mentioned in the documents, some mention exists to improve people experiences, focusing on very concrete elements such as sidewalks, bicycle lanes, crossings, or urban furniture, especially considering the needs of older people, for example, or people with disabilities, but with very, very little attention to gender, for example, a very important topic we know in the transport equity literature. And finally, the instruments analyzed at local level shows very different focus. For example, while the deprived peripheral municipality of Renca indicates more shortcomings related to accessibility to public transport and jobs, more affluent municipalities, for example, Vitacura or Providencia, highlight the opposite problem, referring to the impact of floating population that reach jobs or daily activities on a daily basis. Despite these differences, of course, most of the municipality plans show a more innovative vision than the national or metropolitan policies. Okay, so time to wrap up my presentation. I have 2 minutes left. So the main takeaway of this presentation, I would say that if I can summarize the research in just one paragraph, it would be this one: like, despite substantial evidence coming from transport engineering and the social sciences in Santiago, this currently seems to have like a very limited impact on policy approaches at the urban and metropolitan scale in Santiago. And coming back to our initial hypothesis, we stated at the beginning that Santiago really engaged with more complex scholarly understandings, and we were able to verify this. When the dimensions are mentioned, they usually refer to very aggregate quantitative approaches, describing a baseline problems, aggregate concerns of the populations, without like making distinction between different population groups. And qualitative approaches are rarely mentioned, despite the very valuable insights for urban planning. Local plans seems to be more related to academic debates, including some concrete actions for specific groups. But sadly, we know that like Santiago shows an important territorial fragmentation, and overcoming this situation is key for developing more tailored transport equity solution at the local level. Our second hypothesis was related to the coherence among discourse and actions. The diagnosis in the documents relate to activity concentration, segregation, and mobility issues. It's usually not accompanied by thoughts and actions regarding to forms of urban growth, land use planning, and urban sprawl and its effects as well. And we identify different challenges to overcome this situation. Maybe this could be a good time to discuss at the end of this panel, but basically we identify some challenges from the academia and also from policy and practice. From academia, basically how we communicate better and how we collaborate better with people at the local level, and policy and practice, how we can transition from discourse to coherent actions, and also how we can overcome this territorial fragmentation. To end this presentation, some next steps, I will be interested to explore like municipality disparities in a more large scale study, and also do some in-depth interviews with key actors to have a better idea about government perceptions and commitment towards equitable transport. So thank you so much for your attention. I would love to hear your ideas and feedback at the end of the panel, but yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Ignacio, for the presentation. I made some notes. I'm sure everyone else made some notes, and we'll get to the discussion part of the panel. All right, so from Santiago de Chile, we're going to go to Mexican cities now. I'll hand it over to Angélica Valera from el Colegio de Mexico, who will do a presentation on the challenges to implementing accessibility into urban policy in Mexican cities. So I think this is going to connect very well with the presentation we just heard from Ignacio. All right, and let me introduce Angélica. So Angélica Valera is a PhD candidate in urban and environmental studies at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, architect and master in architecture and urbanism. Her research work is on accessibility, mobility, public policy, and justice in the cities. She has worked as a consultant for public policy evaluations and developed environmental, urban, and social impact assessments for projects in the housing, energy, and hydrocarbon sectors. Also as an expert on infrastructure, housing, and mobility for the Mexican National Territorial Planning Strategy. Angélica, welcome to the panel. Thank you for being here, and please, the screen is yours.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. So we're working on the challenges to implementing accessibility into urban policy in Mexican cities. We have a study case of 2 Mexican cities. The name is León and Querétaro. They're from the central area, the central region of Mexico. So our questions are, which are the policymakers' institutional challenges in integrating an accessibility perspective into planning? And what does accessibility mean for different government areas and policymakers, and how they incorporate it into planning processes? Our research is focused on discovering or exploring those challenges for introducing this accessibility perspective into planning in 2 medium-sized cities from Mexico, which are León and Querétaro. For us, I mean, my supervisor in this case and me, accessibility is the ease of achieving activities depending on the location, transport systems, and the individual resources available. We base our discussion basically on the definition of house and convey that accessibility has 4 components: the land use, the transport, the individual, and the temporal component. We leave aside the temporal, incorporating it into the other 3 components, but we get land use, transport, and individual component, combining with the idea that Duarte presented in 2019, that accessibility, how can we translate accessibility into policies? So we have transport component on transport policy, we have the land use component on spatial planning, and we have the individual component translated into social policy. So when we mix these 3 kinds of policies, then we get accessibility. Either we have a mix between the other 2, we have like a transport and social, then we have a mix of inclusive transport or these things. But to get the 3, we have accessibility. So we are focusing on basically trying to explain why social policies not match with the spatial planning and transport policy. So a bit of our study cases, they're both mid-sized cities for Mexico, which are above 1 million inhabitants. That's middle size for Mexico. It could be very different from other cities or other countries, but they both have like this similar economical structure based on industry, and they have different policies. León, on one hand, is a more transport-oriented city, and Querétaro is more a vehicle-oriented, private vehicle-oriented city. So those are the differences in policies that we want to address, and we have more or less the same demographic structure between the cities, and we also have more or less the same economical structure in the cities. They both belong to this central region of Mexico. Bajío is it called, and is one of the most important economic regions in Mexico. So what we did was also starting from a documentary analysis from the development, land use plans, and transport programs and plans. And then we evaluated around more than 20, it was 25 programs and plans from development and transport and land use. Here in Mexico, we have this structure that every 3 years we have a different municipal government coming in, administration with a new plan. And every 6 years we have a new state or county, let's say, in equivalent government. So then we combine these both scales, because one of the issues is that accessibility and especially transport is in different scales. And then we conducted some focus groups and semi-structured interviews with some policymakers from León and some other from Querétaro. What we got from the analysis is that, first of all, accessibility is never mentioned in the programs. They have like 0 mentions the word accessibility. Well, no, I lied. They have 1 mention. It's in transport. It's a transport plan, and the idea of accessibility is just universal accessibility and linked to universal design. So it's not the accessibility as we understand accessibility in the academia. We have some mentions of land use, transport interaction. We also have some mentions on the relationship between sprawl and the vehicle use. And we also have mentions on mobility, but accessibility as understood by academia or as understood by us is not mentioned. So we conducted a focus group and trying to understand then what does accessibility mean for policymakers. Then we gathered some people from the health department. Then we have land use and transport. Then we had a few that wanted to join from education departments, and they just gathered on different ideas. The people from planning and transport, they just mix planning and transport on this kind of this idea of accessibility to implementing more transport planning, oriented planning. And then people from the health departments and education, they just got it on first universal design, again, universal accessibility, and the others were on understood accessibility also, like how to make low-income kids to get access to school. So it was just a mix of the components, but none of them was talking like with a unit. We don't have very important projects in these in both cities that are trying to implement the social component, especially into land use and transport mix. In León, we have the inclusive urban transport, which is a work between the mobility department and the social institution for the people on the municipal scale. And they have this inclusive urban transport, which are special transportation for people with disabilities. Then they connect them to the BRT system, and then they get more access with the BRT system, and they exchange again into these units, and they get access to parks and more access to hospitals and clinics. So this is one of the people that we're going to go for more in-depth, people in charge on how they solve this idea, how they came to this idea. So we're still working on some interviews on that. And on the other side, in the city of Querétaro, we have the school transportation, which was originally made by the mobility department in Querétaro with the idea of reduce congestion at the hours of the school hours that the kids need to get to schools. And it was designed for people who drove private vehicles to get the children to school, and they wanted to reduce congestion.
Angélica?
But yeah.
Sorry, you have 5 minutes remaining.
Yeah, I'm almost done.
All right, thank you.
So the project, the idea of this policy, of this plan was that, but then the people who got the children into that, it was people from low income areas that represent like a huge saving for them in not paying the bus for taking children to school. So now it's like a superstar plan with this mix between social policy and transport policy, where land use is not exactly there, but it takes you to activities, it takes you to elementary schools and junior high schools. But it was also like unplanned stuff. So for the final remarks, we have a misconception of accessibility. Like that would be one of the challenges that we have at the moment, because we don't understand exactly what accessibility is. And if we cannot translate the concept of accessibility, we cannot implement it. We have a challenge in the influence and power of local government, because some of the, I didn't make an emphasis on this, but one of the things is, for example, transport planning is more for the state government and not for the municipal government, for the local government. So they don't have like a lot of influence on that, but the local government is in charge of all land use planning. So we have to, and we also have this sectorized planning between the local level of government and the state level of government. And then we don't have this mix, we don't have this this link between departments and between government levels. And that would be it.
Okay, thank you, Angélica. Again, I made some notes, and I look forward to the moment where we can have a discussion, and I'm sure that Diego also made some notes, and we can start to see some links between the two presentations, so we'll get to that. But now what we're going to do is that we're going to hand it over to Juan Cabrera, who is going to take us to Bolivia, all right, for a presentation on Paratransit in Bolivia. A presentation about the passenger transport sector and its exclusion in urban policy. So Juan, if you want to start sharing your screen and set up your slides, please go ahead. And let me introduce Juan, all right? So Juan Cabrera is an architect and sociologist from Universidad Mayor in San Andres in Bolivia. He did a PhD in urbanism in University of, I'm going to say this incorrectly, Liège. Liège, okay, maybe you can correct me, Juan, in 2015 in Belgium, and did a postdoctoral research stay in the Universidad Libre in Brussels between 2018 and 2019. So he has been in public service and consultant at the national and international level. And now he's currently a professor of urbanism and researcher in Universidad Privada Boliviana and Universidad Mayor de San Andrés. So he's also the founder of the Bolivian Institute of Urbanism and member of some interesting Latin American research networks. So he works on issues of land, informality, water, urban law, and planning systems. And for a couple of years now, Juan has been working on issues of paratransit and urban expansion. So Juan, thank you for being part of the panel, and we look forward to your presentation. Please take it away.
Thank you, Diego. Hi, everybody. Really thanks for the invitation. I prefer to speak Spanish now for the exposition, so I will start. Okay, propongo esta exposición, el paratránsito en Bolivia y la situación, la exclusión de este servicio de transporte, de este paratránsito en la política pública, una política urbana principalmente. Intentaré ser rápido. Les voy a mostrar un poco la situación urbana de Bolivia, la situación de la política urbana, el proceso de urbanización en el caso boliviano, el paratránsito, los impactos del paratránsito y la exclusión de la política urbana, y unas conclusiones muy preliminares, tomando en cuenta de que este trabajo lo voy todavía desarrollando y en paralelo escribiendo, y está vinculado con algunas otras actividades también vinculadas con el paratránsito que estoy trabajando aquí. El objetivo es más o menos demostrar la ausencia del paratránsito en la política urbana, en la política territorial boliviana, tomando en cuenta de que la relevancia del paratránsito en el caso boliviano, en los temas de urbanización, accesibilidad, etcétera, es fundamental. Para eso estoy estudiando el caso de Cochabamba, que es el área metropolitana donde vivo, y les mostraré algunos resultados. Solo un contexto inicial: Bolivia es el campeón latinoamericano, por lo menos de informalidad. Estamos hablando de que tenemos 69% de informalidad según el FMI. A nivel de empleo, 84% del empleo en Bolivia sería también informal, según la OIT. Y según las investigaciones en el GRA de Perú, Bolivia estaría alrededor del 83% de la urbanización informal. Y esto tiene mucho que ver con el paratránsito, como les mostraré. Nosotros, en la práctica, jamás hemos tenido, en la historia contemporánea y anterior de Bolivia, una política urbana. Toda nuestra política ha sido económica, un poco territorial en los últimos años, pero específicamente urbana. Hemos tenido 4 intentos, si es que se podría decir así, desde los años 70 aproximadamente. Sin embargo, ninguno se ha logrado implementar. Este momento, ONU Habitat junto con el gobierno central están terminando una propuesta que han llamado Política Nacional Integral de Desarrollo de Ciudades. Es el título que se ha puesto y está en la etapa final. Bien, en este proceso, en estos años que más o menos muestro aquí, que se ven un poquito, pero el objetivo es básicamente contarles de que hemos empezado a trabajar temas urbanos territoriales a partir de los años 70. Sin embargo, los temas específicos del transporte y la urbanización han sido siempre muy débiles. No obstante, en la actualidad tenemos, digamos, en términos de planificación, un sistema nacional de planificación que considera básicamente planes urbanos territoriales económicos. Tenemos un plan nacional de desarrollo. Tenemos que desarrollar cada departamento. Bolivia está dividida en departamentos y municipios. Tenemos que desarrollar planes departamentales de desarrollo territorial, o planes territoriales de desarrollo integral, como se llaman. Y a nivel municipal, lo mismo. A nivel transporte, desde el año 2014 tenemos una ley que dice que tenemos que trabajar en los planes nacionales de transporte, planes departamentales y planes municipales. Bien, entonces como contexto institucional, en el caso boliviano es interesante, igual que el latinoamericano por supuesto, porque podemos decir, ante la ausencia de estos servicios, sistemas de planificación o instrumentos de planificación urbana claros, concretos, institucionalizados, como les mostré, no tenemos el tema urbano específicamente, y dentro de lo territorial, lo urbano está totalmente difuminado. Podemos decir que en el caso boliviano, hay básicamente la urbanización se explica a través de 3 procesos, ¿no? Uno que está vinculado con el estado del mercado, que es el más chiquito y el más débil, la necesidad, que es básicamente la que deviene con los asentamientos informales, tomas de tierra, etcétera, y la necesidad más de mercado, que está vinculada con eso, pero va finalmente a buscar el lucro, ¿no? Entonces, este gráfico deviene de un artículo que escribimos hace un tiempo con unos amigos, y precisamente explica las características de urbanización del caso boliviano. Hay que tomar en cuenta, repito, que el tema formal, institucional, el tema, la urbanización planificada, voy a decir, es la más reducida. Es por eso que cuando mostraba el gráfico hace un momento, Grade propone, y casi coincidimos, de que más del 83% del escenario urbano deviene de prácticas informales. Este es un gráfico que más o menos muestra los niveles de expansión urbana que tenemos en el caso boliviano y que deviene básicamente de una política del gobierno nacional desde el año 2016, que para efectos de regularizar la propiedad de la tierra orientó o obligó a que todos los gobiernos municipales amplíen sus perímetros urbanos, y los perímetros urbanos se ampliaron mucho más allá de la necesidad, para ser concreto. Entonces, Bolivia tiene ese tipo de escenarios totalmente informales, muy poquitos planificados al estilo Miami, poco de vivienda social, y en paralelo se están trabajando algunas iniciativas vinculadas con el transporte. El paratránsito es la parte que quiero concentrarme, ¿no? En el caso boliviano no tenemos datos exactos, pero según el último censo, que fue el año 2022, y los datos salieron formalmente el año 2016, más o menos 73% de la población económicamente activa está vinculada con actividades de transporte, venta y otro tipo de actividades. De estas, se estima que más o menos 40% de la población económicamente activa está vinculada directa e indirectamente con el transporte. Eso quiere decir que gran parte de este 40% está dedicada al transporte en áreas urbanas, ¿no? Se entiende el transporte, el paratránsito, como esta forma de transporte, entre comillas, informal, que en el caso boliviano es dominante, con excepción de La Paz, donde tenemos un cable, que seguramente algunos han conocido, y un servicio de buses bastante chico. ¿Qué es el paratránsito? Es básicamente para nosotros una organización de centenares, realmente es un tema desconocido, de sindicatos, asociaciones, cooperativas de transporte que prestan servicios comunitarios, pero al mismo tiempo privados, ¿no? Se agrupan en federaciones departamentales y en confederaciones nacionales, ¿no? Tienen un peso político y social bastante importante, además económico, por supuesto, y tienen muy poco control de los gobiernos municipales. Los gobiernos municipales son los responsables de la gestión del espacio urbano, digamos. Casi todas las decisiones sobre el transporte están coadyuvados por ellos, repito, con muy poca participación del Estado en general, ¿no? Son ellos los que controlan un poco la situación del transporte en las ciudades, y tiene mucho aporte en términos de contaminación, y de alguna forma desde los años 80, que cambiamos de modelo económico, se ha convertido la principal actividad laboral, digamos. Es interesante porque este sistema de paratránsito en el caso boliviano podría casi afirmar que está nulamente estudiado, tanto de que la dimensión espacial del paratránsito es casi desconocida, ¿no? Bien, pero entonces, para explicar la importancia de este paratránsito, lo que estoy haciendo es trabajar en el área donde yo vivo, en el área metropolitana de Cochabamba, que básicamente es una jurisdicción de 7 municipios que tiene más o menos 1.3 millones de habitantes y 29.000 hectáreas aproximadamente, y son 7 municipios, 7 áreas urbanas, ¿no? Este es nuestro sistema de paratránsito. Nosotros en Cochabamba tenemos, todo esto está inventariado por nosotros, con estudiantes a mano, a papel, con GPS, etcétera. Lo que necesita una base de datos. Estamos desde el año 2017 hasta la actualidad realmente haciendo este trabajo de relevamiento. Tenemos micros, coaster, llamamos los coaster japoneses, trufis y los taxitrufis. La modalidad dominante es el trufi, este que está aquí es el mediano japonés, y después vienen los taxitrufis, que son básicamente los coches sedán, ¿no? Miles de centenas y centenas. Son importantes porque según las últimas investigaciones que hemos trabajado, estoy terminando una investigación con mi equipo, y hemos descubierto, se puede decir, unos niveles de que este sistema de paratránsito con estas características que indiqué generan una accesibilidad súper importante en términos de distancia, en términos de tiempo, y como entré aquí. Por ejemplo, del área metropolitana de Cochabamba, 90.93% de la población no tiene que caminar más de 7.5 minutos a alcanzar un servicio de transporte. 73% del área urbana, más o menos correspondiente con 924.000 habitantes, tiene que caminar entre 0 y 22.5 minutos para alcanzar una ruta. En el caso boliviano, uno se para en la ruta, levanta la mano y siempre pararán los taxis, trufis, micros, etcétera, ¿no? En términos de tiempo, estamos hablando de que 90.95% de la población metropolitana no debe caminar más de 500 metros para alcanzar un servicio de transporte. 50% tiene que caminar máximo 100 metros para alcanzar una ruta de transporte. Y a nivel costo, el salario mínimo en Bolivia alcanza $330, aproximadamente, poquito más, poquito menos. El costo es bastante reducido en comparación con otros países de la región, y estamos hablando de que máximo el 10.66% se gastaría en transporte, suponiendo un desplazamiento inclusive de 7 días por semana. ¿Qué es lo particular? Entonces, a nivel accesibilidad, este servicio autogestionado por estas cantidades conocidas de operadores, lo que ha logrado es importante nivel de accesibilidad, a reducidos costos, por lo tanto, permite que la población de las periferias, sin ningún problema, pueda articularse al centro, puede articularse el aparato económico, sin negar que hay muchos problemas de congestión en los centros, problemas de contaminación, y no necesariamente este tipo de servicios, como los chiquitos dominantes, nos brindan mucha calidad o mucha comodidad, mejor dicho. Otro elemento que descubrimos, que tal vez es más importante, es que el paratránsito y este servicio de transporte está totalmente vinculado, tiene una sinergia con los procesos de urbanización, consolidación y expansión urbana principalmente. Ahí identificamos 3 fenómenos, ¿no? La creación de rutas, la extensión de rutas y la subdivisión de rutas, que son unas prácticas autónomas, casi con una nula participación del Estado, en un caso totalmente desconocido, que lo que hacen es, en el tiempo y de acuerdo a demanda de los nuevos fraccionamientos, de los nuevos asentamientos, van creando, van articulando el territorio con servicios de transporte de este tipo como mostrado.
Juan,
Esto supone...
Juan,
Sí.
me quedan 5 minutitos.
Está bien,
¿Sale?
alcanzaré.
Gracias.
Eso supone de que la expansión urbana y la consolidación depende totalmente de este tipo de servicios de transporte. ¿De acuerdo? Entonces, si hablamos mostramos en términos cartográficos esto, podemos mostrar que entre esta expansión urbana 2016 y 2022, digamos, el servicio de transporte es básicamente el que está definiendo y consolidando esta situación. Tomando en cuenta de que la planificación urbanística no existe, ¿no? En sí, es competencia municipal, pero no se la realiza desde los años 80, por lo menos en el caso cochabambino y en general boliviano. Por lo cual podemos decir que los procesos urbanísticos de urbanización, en el caso boliviano, recuperando este cochabambino, recuperando este gráfico, pues están totalmente coadyuvados por el paratránsito. Son una sinergia, son un matrimonio que no se separa. Pero bien, entonces después de esa comprensión del fenómeno, nos animamos a ver cómo está trabajando, si esto se reconoce o no en la política pública. Entonces, para eso está todavía en desarrollo. Hemos analizado la propuesta de política urbana de ciudades, como les decía, del caso boliviano, los planes territoriales de 3, 4, de todos los municipios del área metropolitana, y en todos los casos muestran algunos básicamente dicen que emiten CO2, que no son muy eficientes, en otros casos hablan de una serie de problemas, y en la mayoría de los casos la respuesta es promover un sistema de transporte sostenible, en algunos casos eliminar el paratránsito para implementar BRTs y ese tipo de sistemas que por supuesto son interesantes, y en general esa es la retórica, ¿no? El discurso es muy poco reconocimiento de su rol y de su función, y en la mayor parte de casos las propuestas van por eliminarlas, o hay gobiernos municipales como el Sacaba, que es el municipio más grande en el área metropolitana, segundo más grande, mejor dicho, y por ejemplo reconocen su problemática, pero no se propone nada alrededor. Y bueno, entonces en conclusión, podemos indicar de que este servicio de transporte, este paratránsito, como ahora lo denominamos, mejor dicho, es totalmente desconocido en el escenario urbano boliviano, en los estudios urbanísticos en general del país. Sin embargo, tiene una increíble capacidad para lograr niveles de accesibilidad altos y en ese tanto reducir definitivamente inequidades, ¿no? Hemos hecho una gran encuesta que nos permite corroborar esto, pero además es el que define finalmente la expansión, consolidación, compactación de las áreas urbanas, y no existe en la política pública. Es más, en algunos casos se propone la eliminación para reemplazar por los sistemas, digamos, por supuesto eficientes, de movilidad urbana en general. Eso, muchas gracias.
Thank you, Juan. Gracias por la presentación. Thank you for the presentation. Great. All right. All right. I see a lot of connections between the three presentations, and we'll get to that. We'll get to the discussion. All right. So let's move to our fourth presentation. Orlando Sabogal-Cardona is going to take us to Colombian and Mexican cities now. All right. For a presentation on ride-hailing services and their contribution to inaccessibility and policy implications for Latin American cities. So let me introduce Orlando. Orlando Sabogal-Cardona is an engineer with expertise in studying urban and transportation issues. His doctoral research, well, he's a PhD candidate in the Development Planning Unit in University College London, and his doctoral research lives at the intersection of cycling and the sociological concept of social capital. He expects to shed light on what social capital means and implies for transportation and public policy development, as well as to establish mechanisms to increase the positive effects of social capital and reduce negative externalities. Beyond the PhD thesis, Orlando has other kinds of interests, for instance, ride-hailing, mobility as a service, micromobility, and emerging transport alternatives, accessibility, transport equity and well-being, walkability, and sustainable transport. All right, so Orlando, please take it away. The screen is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
Hi, thank you, David, for that introduction, and thank you, David, Natalia, Ana Maria, and Diego for pushing this special issue. I know it has not been easy, but your commitment to the process has been very helpful. So today I will be talking about ride-hailing mainly, and how it is connected to transport and social disadvantage. Just as a background, but probably you all know a little bit about this, ride-hailing services started around a decade ago, and since then have been constantly growing. Now every major city in the world has some kind of ride-hailing service, but also ride-hailing has evolved, and there are many similar related services around. We have now micromobility that includes e-scooter, that includes bike share systems. We have, for example, very innovative services such as microtransit in Mexico City. And in general terms, the landscape of these app-based mobility services is still an evolving ecosystem. Probably a very good example is Uber Boats that started in Nigeria. That is basically a ride-hailing services, but instead of cars, you get boats. We also have a service like this in London. And regardless of the service, I think, or the general agreement today is that these services are here to stay. Probably they will keep evolving in the future, but definitely the technology that they have incorporated into transportation is here to stay. So it is time to start thinking a little bit in the long term, how these services are going to impact urban mobility. It's talking exclusively about ride-hailing. Our own research, I mean, the research from the authors and from other authors in the same paper and me, have shown that ride-hailing services have usually been conceived as services for not regular trips. That is for the trips you for going to a movie, to go to visit friends and family, for going out for drinks a Friday night, and so on. This has been changing. One of the main arguments we want to make in this project is basically that now ride-hailing is also helping people to make their daily most usual trip, and that's different from the usual narrative around ride-hailing. Nevertheless, research on ride-hailing has focused mainly on the determinants of adoption, on how it is competing and substituting public transit and other transport services, how it is affecting congestion and pollution. But we think that a more social perspective is needed, a perspective that is framed within all the debates that transport agenda have now. So we talk about equity. We now know that well-being is important. We now know that the distribution of the burdens or the benefits of transportation are important. So we think that it is time to start focusing on all these new ideas that have been in transportation for a long time. So in this project, we are going to focus on two main things. As all of the other presenters have said, accessibility is about reaching key opportunities. Probably the most famous definition is the one provided by Hansen, that is stating that accessibility is the potential for interaction. So basically how you can reach different opportunities that are important for you or for people. And there are two ways of doing this, or two ways to think about this. One is accessibility in terms of reaching your main destination. So everybody have a regular trip, your main, most important, most frequent trip. And that's one, let's say, one type of accessibility or one type of trip that you want to analyze. But also we have the occasional trips. The trips that I mentioned are for going to the movies, to visit friends and families, trips that are not your usual trips, but that nevertheless you make a few times in the week or in the month. So we are going to try to focus on these two ideas. Probably the first one, the analysis oriented towards the most frequent trip, is the most innovative in terms that it has not been analyzed in previous literature. Literature always usually focuses on how ride-hailing and app-based mobility services are affecting the non-usual trips, but we also want to include now the regular trip. And as I will show in a bit, there are some important findings explicitly related to this. But we are analyzing this under our theoretical framework that we are calling the app-based mobility social exclusion framework. It is basically a meld between the theory about social disadvantage, the theory about transport disadvantage, and how in the presence of app-based mobility services that have special features and special characteristics produce certain accessibility or inaccessibility, implying that some people can take advantage or not from these services. So basically, you have prior social disadvantage condition, prior transport disadvantage condition, and in the presence of app-based mobility services, you can take advantage or not. You can use it to reach your destination, or it could be the case that it is only providing an alternative for certain very specific people. In the document, in the manuscript, this will be developed with more depth. So for this, we are using data from 2020, when the pandemic started, the COVID pandemic started. We gathered information using a panel service that was very popular at that time during the pandemic. At the best of our knowledge, we gathered the larger ride-hailing survey ever gathered in Latin America and probably in the world. We reached more than 6,000 respondents. That is a huge sample size. We focus on three larger metropolitan areas. One is Colombia, the other one is Medellin, and the other one is Mexico City. And the reason for selecting these cities as case studies is because these are cities that have tried to push their transport system. So in the case of Medellin, for example, you have the metro, you have the cable car systems, you have Encicla, that is a bike share system that people can use for free. In Bogota, you have the famous Transmilenio, you have ciclorutas, you also have cable car systems, you have Pico y Placa, you have many interesting policy initiatives that other cities are trying to imitate. And in Mexico City is always a good case for study because it's a place where all the innovations always arrive. So it's one of the cities, probably not only Latin America, but probably in the world, where technology is always around in terms of mobility. So they have the major ride-hailing companies operating there. They have other services, for example, Paratransit. Before the pandemic, in the city services such as Jetty or Urban were extremely popular. So there are always things happening in Mexico City when it comes to technology. And that's one of the main reasons why we selected the city. Also, the three cities show the regular picture of any Latin American city, where you have a transport system, when you have a lot of people using cars, but where also you have a lot of informality. Switching to the first branch of the analysis, the one focused on the regular trip, the first thing we find is that, as expected, ride-hailing is now a transport alternative used for regular trips. So it is still not a big number. It's probably similar to taxi, or mainly to taxi or to motorbike in Mexico City, but we still have around 4% of people doing their most regular trip, their most usual trip in ride-hailing. for Bogota and Medellin, and around 6% for Mexico City. So again, this is not a big number, but it shows that this technology is not about occasional trips anymore. There is an important share of people using it for the regular mobility. And this is precisely what we want to highlight, that because this brings new questions and this brings new opportunities or new challenges. More importantly, I think, is that we saw something in the sample that probably you all know, but it's always good to highlight, and it is that travel is diversity. So usually in urban planning and in transport planning, we focus on the working trip, and we're interested to getting from A to B and make sure that people can arrive to their jobs. Nevertheless, when we ask the reason for their main trip, we realize that it is not necessarily linked to working trips. So people is doing a lot of care trips, a lot of health trips, just as their most regular trip.
Orlando?
Yes?
Orlando, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay, yes. I'm
thank you.
Start moving faster from now.
Thanks.
So also, we can see that women are relying more on ride-hailing for the most regular trip. This is consistent across the 3 cities, probably more clear from Bogota and Mexico City. Interestingly, also, they're doing it more for non-working trips. So this is the distribution of all the transport modes for gender, and we have working trips and non-working trips. And you can see here that people who use ride-hailing, in the case of women, they use it mainly for non-working trips. So that's interesting. So basically, what the data is showing is that ride-hailing is filling gaps for women for the most regular trip more than it is doing it for men. And another interesting finding is that ride-hailing, when it comes to regular trip, follows a similar pattern to the one followed for all the other transport modes. So the departure times, the schedule of the trips is similar to all the other transport modes. And also, this small share of ride-hailing trips that are conducted for the most regular trip people do are not easy to do in public transportation. So basically, if people were to do that trip on public transportation, they could take more than 20 minutes, and in many cases more than 20 minutes. So it is a trip that that people do probably because they don't have access to a transit station or for any other reason, but clearly there is a transportation gap. We also wanted to calculate how social disadvantage and transport disadvantage is linked to this. So we are proposing an index for measuring social disadvantage and transport disadvantage. Basically, it's based on the variables that you can see on your screen. It's a summary, it's like an average, a weighted average of those variables. And what we find when plotted by transportation mode is that ride-hailing users are usually socially advantaged people in conditions of transport disadvantage. So again, people that, for example, live in transit deserts, but that have the economic means to afford ride-hailing trips for their most regular trip. This, again, is consistent across cities, when some differences, when it's not always the same, but you can always see that ride-hailing in every city is for social advantaged people, but transport disadvantaged people. And now moving to the reasons for having used ride-hailing in the past, for reasons not necessarily related to your most regular trip. Here we have a ranking of the main reasons for Bogota. Sorry, happens to for Bogota and for Mexico City. For Medellin, it was very similar to Bogota, so I'm not presenting it here. And you can see that the main reasons are because other modes were too slow, because it was night and too dark, because people were traveling with bags, or because there was not public transit available. And when we see that by whether or not the people has some levels of transport disadvantage or social disadvantage, we see that usually for transport disadvantage, the bus plots are similar. So in some cases, it is because you have a problem of transport provision, but usually always the people who manage to say that is a reason is people who have high levels or higher level than social disadvantage, the people that are not using ride-hailing for those reasons. It happens for traveling on other modes when it was too slow. It happens for when people say that they use ride-hailing because it was difficult to find parking at the destination. Here, probably the difference is more important than in the previous case. Also because when they didn't have access to the vehicle in their family, the transport disadvantage levels are similar. But then again, what makes the difference is that they were more socially advantaged people. It also happened for night trips. And so just as a summary, what we're trying to do with this work is providing first a theoretical framework useful for analyzing app-based mobility in general and ride-hailing specifically through the lenses of transport disadvantage and social disadvantage, and see how that could impact accessibility. We also find that ride-hailing is now a transport alternative used for regular trips. It is not only about non-usual trips, and more importantly, that women are using it more than men, and for non-working trips. And also, as a final conclusion, that ride-hailing is providing increased accessibility in very specific situations, such as traveling with bags, such as when it is dark and such as when it's night and too dark. But just socially advantaged population is in the position to use the service in those situations. Thank you. I think I'm on time, right?
Perfectly on time, Orlando. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, after those 4 wonderful presentations, and thank you everyone for sharing your work with us, we're now going to move to our commentator. We'll hand it over to Diego Hernandez, and let me introduce Diego. All right. So Diego Hernandez is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences and in the Universidad Católica del Uruguay. He's a sociologist with a master's degree in political science and a PhD in urban studies, right? So perfect mix for these kind of discussions. He develops research on transport, mobility, social exclusion, and equity in Latin America, including spatial accessibility, affordability, and gender mobilities. His recent research work includes, among others, projects on healthcare accessibility for children in Montevideo from a time geography perspective, and the effect of spatial accessibility by public transport and labor performance. He has published his research work in scientific journals and books published by reputed international publishers. He has worked as a consultant for national and international institutions, and it is no exaggeration to say that Diego has been one of the leading voices in Latin American scholarship, putting forward the study of accessibility. He has at least 10 years publishing in this field in international peer-reviewed journals, and is an absolute honor to have Diego here to be the commentator of the panel. So Diego, please take it over. You have up to 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, for your introduction. You're very generous, too generous. Well, first, I want to thank Juan, Orlando, Ignacio, and Angélica for these great presentations. I think we have a lot of material to discuss. It is very interesting that some of these reflections, I think we have already started to discuss them last week, and that's very good news. It suggests us that we have pretty consistent frameworks to analyze these issues. I think these 4 presentations, we have like the first 2 presentations by Ignacio and Angélica. To some extent, they address the general discussion, and the last 2 by Orlando and Juan, they address like specific cases that illustrate very well some of the aspects of the general discussion. So I think they complement very well the discussions, and they give us a lot of elements to discuss. So what is in the center of the discussion? Accessibility. And I think one of the main issues to point out has to do with that accessibility from a policy perspective should be conceived as the impact of mobility policies. So to some extent, connectivity is the output to have shorter trips, to have less congestion, and so on and so forth. But from an accessibility approach, what it is important to note it is that accessibility is the impact of the policy, the final impact on well-being. What we are trying to maximize is the capacity of people to fulfill their needs and desires in the city. And that is what accessibility should, what policy, transport policy or mobility policy should provide. Of course, mobility is a very important component of that impact, but it's just one component. Accessibility goes well beyond mobility. And that is one of the first disconnections between policy and the academics. And I think there is a challenge there that we need to communicate that the final goal of mobility policies is not to connect, but to provide accessibility. This is the difference from policy theory between impact and output. You can have a project that gives money for poor households. So the output is the provision of money, the transfer, the cash transfer. But the impact is the well-being of the household, that they send kids to school and so on and so forth. So here is the same. The impact of your policy is that people is able to participate in urban activities. They may participate outside their household or they can be online, but the impact is there and has to do with that participation. One of the problems that is very important, I think you present very well here, is that connectivity will have a better impact for the affluent households. If we focus on the output and not the impact, we are intrinsically benefiting the wealthier households. Because if we focus on connectivity and infrastructure, what we are doing is distributing the benefits more on car holders than on people that walk, people that go by bicycle, people that ride the public transport. And I think that's why it's so important to have this discussion we are having today. So another point that I want to mention here is, I have a question here, is that do we need better communication, or what we need is better leverage in the policy field? My problem here is do they really understand? Policy officials, they don't understand, or they do understand, but they don't care? I think that's a question that we won't answer here, but it is very important, I believe, because to focus on accessibility and to adopt an accessibility approach is much more difficult for policy officials. Of course, it's more difficult to measure. You have to know access to which type of opportunities, for whom, dealing with what type of obstacles. The number of obstacles are much higher and of different nature. So in that case, it's very difficult to address from policy makers all that type of obstacles. So to really focus on accessibility from policy makers is really difficult, and it's much more expensive also. So to some extent, my question here to discuss is, well, we need to communicate better, or what we need is to have more influence. I don't know who should have more influence, but here is the question. Do policy officials really don't understand this point? I think there is a mixed problem there. They don't really conceive mobility as part of the accessibility, more general accessibility problematic, but I think it is also a problem of, well, we can't deal with that, period. Let's go, let's move for the next topic, you know. And I think accessibility, of course, as you present here, it's very useful to illustrate equity issues. But the other face of the same coin is that it is also very useful to make inequality visible. And that sometimes is a politically not very sympathetic for officials. Well, another issue that is here, and I think it is important to point out, is that here we make very visible that it's very important the relationship between urban form as a key component of accessibility. So to some extent here is that mobility is just a part of accessibility. Accessibility goes well beyond transport. I think urban form is a piece that we need to pay much more attention. And from the four presentation, I think we can conclude that that is very important. These presentations also call us to think about different modes. For instance, paratransit or ride-hailing devices. It is important to think about different trip purposes, trip modes. I think that's very relevant. So one of the general comments, and I think it's like a bottom line, that we have to be clear about this is that mobility is not enough to address and deal with accessibility issues. Of course, transport is not enough either, right? I have only one minor comment. We focus in the first two presentations on plans. I think we shouldn't avoid the temptation of thinking that both authors don't do that, but it is important that plans are closer to real life, but they still are pretty far from real life and what actually happens in cities. So of course, plans are very important, are a very important piece of empirical evidence to understand our mobility policies, but sometimes they are like letra muerta, dead letters. I'm not sure, but they are just a piece of paper. And of course, they are very helpful to understand policy approaches, but they may not reflect at all the actual policy approaches in our cities. Another point is that scale is extremely important. Scales remind us about governance levels, but also remind us about the challenges of adopting complex frameworks to understand policies. What I'm talking about here is that, for instance, national and broader scales should set the framework and approaches for the general policies. But this is a circle that needs to be closed. So there is a challenge here to avoid the risk of very abstract recommendations without concrete policies application. And on the other hand, the other way around is the same. We need local plans and measures that even when they are very concrete, they should be able to define and adopt strategic principles. This is the circle that it is intrinsically mentioned in all the panel here. So because here what you have always when you say, well, you have to be more careful about accessibility and so on and so forth, well, but what should I do with this bus stop in this corner? It is always that question. Okay, so you come here with very good ideas, but what should we do? And that is a very important thing to be cautious about, because sometimes we can have the risk of only taking very general frameworks without closing that side circle. And sometimes you need to, and scale for that sake is very important, to adopt different analysis scales. Well, the discussion regarding observed versus potential accessibility is very close to this session content too, in the sense that it is important to see potential accessibility and to be aware of every type of obstacles, but it is also important to see actual and observed mobility, how people move, what is the cost people are affording to move from one point to a special location to another in the city. Well, to think about accessibility also makes us to include informal services. I think that's clear from the presentations. And in that sense, integration is very important, but not only traditional fair network integration. We may need as well knowledge integration, integration between academics and policy staff and technical staff of public offices. And maybe we also need integration of informal services, at least to analyze accessibility. So integration is a very important concept that raised here in the panel. And finally, for general comments, it is really important to this discussion, the technical capacities of government offices. Some of these discussions has to do especially with the capacity of technical officials to discuss with academics, because this is like another level of possible gaps. One thing is that elected officials, let's say, they don't understand this, but you have a much more serious gap if technical capacities doesn't allow the technical staff to understand this. I think there we have a starting point that is much worse than the one we would have if only public officials don't understand this. And I think there is underneath, there is a discussion here that we should address. In the final presentation, Orlando mentioned it has to do with the digital divide. It is becoming more and more important, the smart cities approach, digital skills. It is a new sphere for the social dimension mentioned by Angélica, that digital skills, capacities, resources are very important, or will be much more important to understand transport disadvantage and accessibility issues. And I think that is a very important thing that we need to consider, and accessibility framework fits to have this discussion, and that's important. Some particular comments, very short. Well, for Ignacio, I think that you have a great work, because you did a great work of a systematic definition of dimensions. That is really, really important. My only question here is about plans. You know, plans. How much plans really reflects real policy adoption? That's like my question here. Okay, well, about technical stuff, I think that's very, very important to maybe in future work to have this distinction between public officials or the results of plans and technical staff. So what is the problem here? So technical staff in sector do understand, but political official doesn't. That I think would be very interesting. To Angélica, I think there is a very interesting case when you get to the empirical evidence. I see that you discuss two very concrete policy interventions. I was waiting for a more general approach of the transport policy. I'm not sure if like these are the two relevant cases for some reason. It would be very interesting to mention that, explicitly mention. I am addressing the program for disability people and the school transport program for this reason. And it is important for because the discussion is, I think, addressing general policy context, but empirical evidence is like much more focused on specific plans. So it will be interesting to say why, you know. Well, from Juan, I think this is very important, and Juan, I think, points out a very important tension here. It has to do with implication for accessibility of paratransit or informal services, how to deal with advantages and disadvantages of these services. Because on the one hand, it is clear that they are solving problems. On the other, it is clear that they are also maximizing some problems. So emissions, low density growth, because the same issue, well, they follow the demand. It's great, but on the other side, sometimes you don't want to have that demand because you are growing, you are having urban, low density urban growth. Informal services has such a potential for adaptation and accommodation for that demand that it is great to solve accessibility issues in the short run, but you are basically having in the long run, you are having more problems, and that, I think, it's a important thing to take into account. And Orlando, well, I think Orlando puts on the table a very important topic. It has to do with what I mentioned before regarding digital skills. We need to address digital skills. We made a research with a colleague here, and what we find is that the same variables that explain transport disadvantage also explain transport digital disadvantage. And that's a very important issue from splintering urbanism perspective. We cannot take for granted that smart cities will solve some social issues. And I think that's important. I have a couple of questions for Orlando. Is what type of survey did you use? It is a lot of cases. I think it is like an online survey, I guess. So we should be aware of online surveys potential bias. That's something that I think we have to discuss more about this. And the second comment is, can we really state that ride-hailing is a mode for regular trips? If I am right, it's like 4 or 6% of trips. Aren't we overstating? I think it could be a risk to overstate the importance of this mode. Maybe 4 or 6% it's a lot, or maybe it's a starting point for a tendency. But I have this question, and well, after that, I'm not sure how many cases do you have to open some variables and categories, because if there are, to describe regular users for regular trips, ride-hailing user for regular trips, for variables that have a lot of categories, you may have a problem of bias for categories with less cases, and that could be a risk in order to describe some variables. So again, thanks very much for all participants. We have great presentations, and I think we will have a very interesting discussion. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Diego. Before we move to a round of responses by panel participants, why don't we open it up to other people in the room? So if anyone wants to make a question or add a comment, please, this is a good time to do it. Just raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone.
They could also write them down in the chat.
Yeah, people can also write questions in the chat or comments in the chat. You know, while people think about the questions they might make, I do have some specific questions that I would like to do to each of the presentations. And my questions are going to be, where I'm going to come from with these comments is in the face of the peer review process. All right, so just thinking about some issues that might be further discussed in the articles to make the peer review process a little bit more smooth, right? So let me start with Ignacio. Ignacio, look, in moving forward, like next steps, next iterations of this research project, I think that it might be useful to make a distinction between what you call, what the authors are calling spatial planning instruments and policy instruments, because you put the concept of a spatial planning instrument and then empirically you analyze the plans, right? And this is problematic, as Diego was suggesting, because the plan, unless it is something that becomes mandatory and becomes part of a regulation, a plan, it's difficult to conceptualize as a policy instrument, right? Maybe the plan is a little bit more a repository of the agenda or the priorities of the agenda, but there's a little jump between from a plan to a policy instrument, like a regulatory policy instrument, a fiscal policy instrument, an organizational policy instrument, so on and so forth, right? So in moving forward, it might be interesting to start looking at specific policy instruments and see if accessibility concepts really translate into policy instruments. And a question that I have for you, Ignacio, is, all right, so empirically, the authors are identifying these gaps, right, between the knowledge that we have in accessibility and the plans, the gaps. My question to you is, what is the meaning of these gaps for the accessibility literature? So you identify the gaps. What do you think it means for what we know about accessibility and policy? What is the meaning of that? What are their implications, right? I think this will be important to discuss in the discussion part of the article. All right, Angélica, fascinating study. Well, I'm Mexican, so I'm always interested in Mexican cities. Look, I think Diego mentioned something important here, this jump between the concept of accessibility, right, and its dimensions to policy has to be done through, and you have this analytical framework there, right? It has to be done through social policy, transport policy, and land use policy. All right. But, you know, as Diego was stating, your case study clearly shows that different kinds of policies get more attention in the accessibility discussion, right? It seems to me that most of the attention is in transport policy and maybe a little bit in social policy, but definitely less attention in land use policy. And look, the cases, the finding that you have, the case study you showed about this understanding of accessibility as more like related to the able body and helping specific groups of people to reach their destinations. To me, it shows some sort of a assemblage between mobility and social policy, ensembling there to shape our understanding of what accessibility policy should look like, right? But that speaks to the social construction of problems. Like somehow in Mexican policy circles, we have constructed the policy of accessibility as supporting specific groups in society to reach their destinations, but why not other kinds of people, right? That begs the question of why do we shape that understanding in that way, but not in other way? Like, why don't we shape an understanding about helping low-income workers or helping women or helping, you know, other kinds of publics that are just not getting there into this social construction of the problem and their solutions, right? So I think this is an interesting insight that could be derived from your work. Juan, fascinating work. I love Bolivia. I have some work on La Paz, and I just find it fascinating. It's just beautiful, beautiful place to study. I've been in those paratransit public services that you speak about, and I know what you're talking about. So it's fascinating to hear your presentation. Here, look, here's one thing, Juan. In the accessibility literature, we usually do a distinction between access to public transport systems and accessibility. And I think that the manuscript will benefit from addressing this distinction, right? Because as Diego was explaining, accessibility is the outcome, right? Is achieving that different groups of urban populations actually reach the places and access the resources that are necessary for their day-to-day life and fulfill their life, right? So accessibility is the outcome, and mobility is a component that enables that outcome of accessibility. So we make this distinction of accessibility and access, right? So we can do empirical research about access to public transport infrastructures or paratransit, and then ask the question about, is that access really supporting processes of accessibility, right? So there are two these different things that I think the manuscript might benefit from making that analytical distinction. And Orlando, I have a question for you, maybe for the discussion section of the paper. So you have this fascinating finding that ride-hailing services are starting to be used as the main mode of transport from some segments of the population, right? My question is twofold here. One of them is, what do you think that this means for the literature and accessibility? Like, what is the implication of this finding for the knowledge that we have about accessibility overall? And also, what do you think is the implications of this for debates on urban equity? Like, is this an equitable outcome that we should be like happy to identify, or like, what does it mean for equity? All right, before we go with panel presenters, let's just open it up again to anyone in the audience. If anyone has a question. Okay, there's a couple of questions here. One by Ana Marcela to Ignacio. What is the meaning of concrete actions? How can you identify this relational dimension of mobility to content analysis? And then to Orlando, I understand that the concept of disadvantage that you talk is related to age and gender, but what about age and people with impairments? And if these modes can change the accessibility for these groups? All right, there's another question from Ignacio, but maybe you can make your question, Ignacio, when you have the microphone, or Juan, you can read this question. All right. Let's do a round of responses, maybe in the same order. Okay, so we can start with Ignacio and then we'll move it ahead.
Thanks, David. A lot of different things to approach in the Diego's comment, and then some questions from you, from Diego as well, and from the chat. So, yeah, I mean, starting with Diego's comments related to the plans and real policy adoptions, I agree with you. And basically, we observe that kind of mismatch between plans and like concrete policy actions, particularly at national, regional level. For example, in Chile, when in the previous government, it was like promised that we will have like 800 new kilometers of cycle lanes, and we don't have 800 right now. It was like a statement, maybe like an intention to have like sustainable mobility, but basically we don't concrete that kind of plans in the next 4 years. So I agree that analyzing plans is not the same as analyzing like real projects, basically. But in the case of local instruments, all the municipal at the municipal level, most of the plans that we analyze are very recent, and there is kind of like prioritization list for receiving funds and applying it to the local level. So we are expecting to have like a more one-to-one in terms of like plan and policy application in the coming years. I agree with you that, of course, we can like expand a little bit the analysis in terms of analyzing particular projects, but in this case, we analyze just like a wide range of plans at different scale levels, and probably for future work, we'll try to analyze more in depth the concrete policy actions. Regarding David's comments, always also related to this, like plans and regulations for policy instruments and the differences. I agree with you. It might be useful to make like a very good distinction in terms of like spatial planning instruments and policy instruments, and being clear what is like the analysis that we did in this paper. Probably will be spend a little bit more the last part of the paper when we propose this future work, because we know that this is like in the starting point, and taking that like this work as a starting point, I think it's important to highlight as well something that Diego mentioned about the role, for example, of like technical staff and political decision makers, and also like the participation, like public participation, because I participated in a project with colleagues from Colombia and Brazil as well, a project that we finished like this year. And we had interviews with decision makers in the 3 countries, exploring like how they perceive transport equity, how they try to apply transport equity principles into practice. And we had this sense that technical staff is very open to these new trends and to apply some of the academic concept or dimensions that we see in literature, but they are very like constrained by political decisions. And they say that actually it's very difficult to include like new criteria in very established evaluation frameworks. For example, cost-benefit analysis is like the rule in Chile at least. And it's hard to include like equity criteria or include any other kind of indicators as accessibility indicators, for example. So even when they are open to include these kind of things, they face like some institutional barriers and also like political decisions that are not aligned with their interests. So this is important to highlight as well, considering the question of David and David about like the gaps. I think that there's a huge gap there. Basically, we have like a huge evidence in Santiago. We have interest from staff and from some like community participation, but we are not able to concrete or to like propose plans that are aligned with those trends in academic or the technical staff. So we have like a huge challenges there. And finally, not to take like all the time, I saw the questions from Anna, I think, about the meaning of concrete actions. Basically, it's any kind of policy, norm, or concrete project that is mentioned in the plan. Because in some of the plans or the documents, we see like just very general or aggregate statements about like we should do, like we should alleviate congestion, we should reduce travel times. But how do you translate those kind of discourse into specific policy plans or regulations? And we tried to analyze that and how it was mentioned in the different documents, and how we can identify the relational dimension of mobility through content analysis. Basically, this is like a very aggregate dimension, and in each dimension we identify like some key concepts. So, for example, we look at mobility of care, for example, considering that this is like very related with the relational dimension of mobility. And no one has mentioned that. As I mentioned in my presentation, there's like very, very little mention about gender, for example, and gender is related to mobility of care as well. So we try to explore that kind of things in the different documents through our content analysis. That's everything for now, just to give a space presenters as well.
Thank you, Ignacio. Let's move on with Angélica, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Diego and David, for your comments. Indeed, there was a gap, like a gap between where I was talking on the general level, and then I went to very specific projects that are executing now. But on the manuscript, we will go like little by little and also check on the more general issues on transport, like the BRT and the other ideas, which also is like the explanation on time, how they started linking land use and transportation, which is one of David's comments. And then they move to starting to include the social dimension, like little by little, with these ideas of these new projects that they're executing, for example, for the people with some disabilities, and they connect it to the main system and then to the other side. But that was why I had these plans in specific. I didn't make it clear on my presentation, which is something that I must take a note on, but that was the idea on how through time they first started thinking how to link land use and transportation, and then they're adding this social dimension with all the restrictions that they have. And also this is another thing, like we are looking at plans, but we're also looking at projects, like concrete projects, and we are talking to these actors because yes, I thought that's very interesting what they all said, like they don't understand or they just cannot apply it or don't want to apply it. So that's something that start me thinking about. And also they have, like, of course, limitations in human resources and economic resources, and yeah. So we will discuss this, and then we'll come with the manuscript with this input. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angélica. All right, Juan, por favor, la pantalla es tuya.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Diego, and for all the comments. Really, I prefer to speak Spanish. My English is not wonderful. If I speak English, I will take longer. So it's better.
Adelante, adelante.
Okay.
Bienvenido.
Thank you. Diego, sí, tomaré en cuenta mucho tus sugerencias, tus comentarios. Evidentemente hay una tensión, ¿no? Hay una tensión entre este sistema y todo este servicio de transporte en general. Y como dices tú, si bien puede ser una solución chiquita, concreta, a la larga supone un problema mucho más grande. Una reflexión alrededor, creo que es muy importante ese punto, cuestionar un poco eso, y por supuesto todo lo que ha comentado alrededor. Sobre el comentario de David, sí, evidente. Mira, hemos estado revisando mucha bibliografía sobre el tema de accesibilidad y creo que no hay un consenso, ¿no? O sea, lo que menos hay es consenso sobre estas cuestiones. Y nosotros al final, cuando decidimos medir la accesibilidad, un poco nos condicionó el tipo de información que tenemos o que hemos podido acceder. En ese entendido, utilizando las referencias de Wegner, Thompson, Santos de las Rivas, Pons, Reines, etcétera, que están básicamente sugiriendo la accesibilidad como esta posibilidad de llegar al servicio de transporte, y el servicio de transporte te permite llegar a una serie de puntos, de servicios, de infraestructuras, etcétera. Básicamente, para medir esto, hemos tomado tiempos, distancias, densidad de las rutas, costo del transporte, y ahora estamos complementando, por ejemplo, con cuánto podemos acceder a las infraestructuras y equipamientos específicos. Entonces, estamos viendo por ahí, digamos, para medir, esta es una cuestión mucho más centrada en estas 4 o 5 variables, digamos, va por ahí. Entonces, no obstante, en el artículo justificaré, explicaré y abundaré, digamos, en la literatura sobre la que nos apoyamos. Sobre los comentarios de Ignacio y de Rodrigo, Sí, cuando hablamos de para, evidentemente suponemos que es el otro, ¿no? El complemento a. Sin embargo, quienes más han desarrollado esta noción contemporánea de paratránsito son una serie de investigadores africanos, ¿no? Bueno, en países de África, donde los servicios de transporte son como los bolivianos. Y a esto se empezó a llamar paratránsito como un sinónimo de transporte informal, básicamente, y no necesariamente complementario. En el caso de Cochabamba, en el caso de Bolivia, con excepción de La Paz, que David conoce, donde hay un metro, donde hay un cable y donde hay unos buses que tienen coberturas de 1 o 0.65% de respecto a los viajes, podríamos hablar de una suerte de paratránsito, complemento. Pero en el resto de ciudades de Bolivia, exactamente todas tienen este tipo de sistema. Y la denominación está abordada por todos estos investigadores que han trabajado en África, ¿no? Tomar estos como paratránsito, pero o paralelo a los sistemas convencionales que deberían existir. Porque en el caso nuestro son los oficiales, entre comillas. Por eso son los oficiales, son los únicos que tenemos, ¿no? No sé si respondo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Juan. All right, let's hand it over to Orlando. Please go ahead.
Okay, I have 8 questions to answer, I think. So I'll try to go very rapidly by each one of those. So in terms of the comments from Diego, I think, yes, there is a clear distinction between mobility and accessibility and between the impact and the outcome. I would say that there is that thinking about accessibility gives space to think about additional instruments beyond transport. For example, then you can think about land use. And I do believe that the lack of integration between transportation planning and land use planning is probably one of the biggest issues in Latin American cities. We have this urban spread that is not considering that those new housing that new housing should have public transportation infrastructure and other things, that when you build employment centers or new hotspots of employment, then you have to think about transportation. So again, it is a trade-off. You gain more complexity when you think about accessibility than when you think about mobility, but then you also get more instruments to interfere or to have an impact on accessibility and to have different outcomes. In terms of whether we are communicating bad or politicians have no leverage to take action, I will say something that is not very popular, I know, sorry about that, but I would take the focus out of politicians and would take it to the citizens, because at the end, and someone is saying that on the chat, even politicians make their decisions as per their political interests. I think that's right. Sometimes the reason why policymakers decide not to invest in public transit and improve accessibility, and they prefer to go for highways that we know are not going to solve anything and are probably worse for our mobility or for our accessibility, because that's what people want. If a candidate suddenly says, okay, I will not invest in highways, I will move the money to bike share, to public transit, that person is probably not going to be elected. So I think if there is a shift to be done, is on the citizens, is more on what people is expecting from the politicians. Now, in terms of the comments specific comments to the work I presented, yes, it might be a bias in our sample. Sadly, as I mentioned, the survey was conducted early in the pandemic. We originally were planning to do it to have household surveys where we could reach people without access to smartphones. At the moment, those were the times it was even illegal to go to a house and do a survey because we were in the pandemic. So the best way to do it was using panel services. The issue is, yes, these are electronic surveys, so you need some digital knowledge, you need some access to internet, some access to smartphones. So it could be a bias in the sample. And nevertheless, one of the good things about using panel services is that these companies make an effort to try to give you a sample as representative as possible of the real population, because panel services are not expected to be used for transport. They are expected to use for market research. So this is a problem they are familiar with, and they have tried to solve it in the past. But nevertheless, it is it is probably a barrier or a gap that we should acknowledge in the document. In terms of the overestimation of ride-hailing users, I would say that it is the other way around, that maybe we are underestimated it. When we first talked about the possibility of some people using ride-hailing for the most regular trip was because in other ride-hailing services, we started noticing that over time, more and more people were saying that they were using ride-hailing more than 5 times per week. So if you're using it more than 5 times per week, it probably means that you're using it for the daily mobility. So I could say that we don't really know what's happening there. Maybe a 4% or a 6% in our sample is a large number. Maybe the real number is a little bit lower, but still at 2% and 3% from a service that has been around in Mexico for 5 years, I think 7 years, is a big number, and it is increasing. So that's what we want to put on. In terms of the categorization of users, and as we have comparatively a small sample size of regular ride-hailing users compared to non-regular users, that's one of the reasons why we decided to move with more descriptive analysis for this paper and not a more elaborated statistical model, because then yes, that could be an issue. There are the statistical solutions. You could come with a model accounting for that and do add some corrections, but we try to keep it simple, just with descriptives. And ask about the index and about gender, age, and impairment. That was considered. We are not including gender in the measurement of social disadvantage, because being a woman or being a man, I mean, it doesn't make you. It is not a social advantage or a social disadvantage, and it could be ethically questionable if we add that as a measure. That's why we prefer to get the index and then just make the distinction by gender. We are considering age because as Diego said, at some point you have digital divide, people facing digital divide, and this could be the case of elder people. Also, younger people are more mobile, they're more able to use transportation systems and so on. We are not considering impairment, but not because we don't think it is important, not because we think that it should not be considered, but because it was not in our sample. It was not a variable we asked. But definitely in future iterations or replications or in other indexes, if available, it should be considered, definitely, as well as other variables. The bit when you mentioned the accessibility implications and the equity implications, I would say that what we're seeing is that ride-hailing is providing enhanced accessibility for certain people. So yes, it is improving accessibility, but in a critical way. So yes, it is improving accessibility, but for very specific users. So people living in certain places with certain income and with other specific characteristics. And there was a comment about policies as fantasies. I imagine as fantasies means policies that are very difficult to implement in real life. I could say that yes, it happens. Sometimes there are some ideas that are not pragmatic or very difficult to get into action, but also we could borrow inspiration for policies that have worked in the past. There are many cities that have tried many things in the past and that have actually worked. So for example, if you want to build a BRT system, you have plenty of cities and plenty of experiences of what has worked and what has not worked. If you want to build a bike share system, you could go to Medellin and see what Encicla did and what Buenos Aires did and Montevideo did. If you are thinking about cable systems, you can come to Colombia and see what Colombian cities are doing, as well as in Bolivia. So I think, yes, some policies might be difficult to implement, but there are also many policies that have been tested in the past and that we could use or replicate in other cities. I think that's everything that was asked related to me, I think.
All right, thank you, Orlando. Well, thank you, everyone. You know, I wish we had another more couple of hours to be discussing this, but unfortunately, we have to end the panel now. I thank Juan, Angélica, Orlando, and Ignacio for participating in the panel. I thank Diego for the comments, and I thank every participant in this room that joined the discussion, and I thank everyone for your comments in the chat. Authors, I hope that this was useful. You know, the purpose of this is, you know, just to have a little sparring session ahead of the peer review process. And I hope that the comments that were made here add to that end. So let's end the panel there. Thank you, everyone. We have 2 more panels next week. All right, we'll meet for a couple of panels. And yeah, thanks, everyone. See you next week.